So welcome everybody. Welcome to the World of Reconnects Network Webinars and Conversations Cafe program. My name is Sylvia, and I will be your host and your tech support today. Today, we are going to have, oops, I skipped the welcome. So today we're going to have the webinar and conversation cafe with Jeremy Lent on the topic of principles and practices of deep transformation, which is also the topic of his course and based on his Web of Meaning book. One of the things that we will be doing today, and I would like you to relax and and think about these questions. We're gonna go and navigate through these questions with Jeremy. How did we get here in this situation? Who am I?
Would you like a turkey
Where am
sandwich
I?
with cheese and ketchup?
The turkey sandwich, if you can mute yourself. Thank you. What am I? How should I live? Why am I? Where are we going? And how do we get there? So with those questions, I invite you to relax. Again, mute yourself. I still hear many voices and many background noises. And we are going to invite Jeremy to start. But before that, I would like to share with you the outline of the webinar today. We will have a presentation for Jeremy for about 30 minutes. During those 30 minutes, I really encourage you to not just be muted, stay muted, but also, you can start jotting down questions, things that arise for you while he talks about the different things. After that presentation, we will open the floor for some questions, and then we will go all to breakout rooms along with the guys. The guys are people who have taken Jeremy's course and can help you navigate the questions. And then we will close with Q&A with Jeremy, where everybody is welcome to participate. The webinar is 2 hours, and we will be announcing the timing as we go through the things. Again, please mute yourself. Thank you. Jeremy, it's all yours. And you're muted, Jeremy. I think you muted yourself.
I did. Thank you so much there. Yeah. Well, thanks, Sylvia, for that great introduction. And yeah, just wanted to say how excited I am to be really able to share these ideas with everybody in this group today. And it's especially wonderful feeling to be both introducing some of these ideas to people who might be looking at them at the first time, and also to be joined by so many people who actually went through this whole course that we did in the spring, and are able to then kind of share with you in breakout groups later on, their direct experience of the course and what it felt like. So what a lovely opportunity to sort of weave in our initial course that we did last spring with the upcoming course coming in the fall. And what I'm going to do in this presentation is really take you through like a taster of essentially, as like from a high level, like what the course actually unfolds. So you'll get like a feeling of it. And at the end of giving this presentation, if anyone has a question they want to ask, just a general question that arises from what I'm taking you through, we're going to have a few minutes of just a general Q&A. So if there's something like a burning question around these themes, that'll be a chance for to ask it in the webinar, and we can all, and I can answer it with us all together. Then we'll go into the breakout rooms. I'll give you a question to ask to discuss that. Well, you can also talk to it. Like, fortunately, we may not have room for every breakout room to have an alumnus or alumna, but hopefully most will, so you can talk to them, ask them any questions, And then we'll get back together as a whole group again. So in a rough sense, that's where we're going. So now I'm going to share the screen, and hopefully that will work well. And well, so this is the name of the course itself, Principles and Practices of Deep Transformation, laying the groundwork for an ecological civilization. And as we go through this, you'll get a sense basically of what I mean when I'm talking about an ecological civilization. And let me just
laying the groundwork.
Okay, here we are. And basically what is so interesting is that here we are in this webinar of the work that reconnects, and this amazing framework that Joanna Macy has developed over so many years, and the overlay between the framework that people who are part of the work that reconnects really are part of, and the parallels between that framework and the framework of this 10-week course, they're so aligned that I thought it was kind of interesting to actually structure the presentation today on the framework of the work that reconnects, how we go from gratitude to knowing our pain, to seeing with new eyes, and then going forth and what that means. And so it'll be interesting to sort of see how that kind of spiral relates so well to everything that we're doing in this 10-week course. And so to begin with, just going to spend a few moments on this beginning place that Joanna loves to begin with, like this place of gratitude. And a good place, I feel, to sort of ground that gratitude is here in this picture of our beautiful living earth, where we can just really maybe take a moment and have gratitude for this incredible jewel of a planet, the only place that we know of right now in the universe where we know that life exists. And billions of years ago, life first emerged on this tiny little jewel in space. And it evolved over billions of years to this incredible richness and abundance. And then it's really only been in the last couple of 100,000 years that one particular species developed this power to impact life itself in many ways. Of course, the human species. And so we obviously, one of the biggest, most important questions we can ask is, what impact have our species, humanity, had on life on Earth? And it's really at that moment, that kind of key moment of asking, that we have no choice really but to move into that next phase of knowing our pain. Because I don't need to tell any of you who are a part of this webinar today, what we are looking at right now in the human impact on Earth is a terrifying future that human activity has brought onto all of life on this Earth. Everywhere we look now around the world, there's wildfires and floods and drought. And of course, we know these are just the beginnings of what is going to unfold worse and worse with this kind of with this climate emergency we're facing. And while some you hear some sort of statesperson talking about how we're going to get down to 1.5 degrees, and that's basically been given up on now as any kind of reasonable target. Even the 2-degree number, which is the most optimistic we could probably hope for right now for this century, scientists call it prescription for disaster. And right now we're heading more towards what is viewed as a catastrophic warming by the end of the century of 3 degrees plus, because of the zone of cascading, amplifying feedback effects that take place. So this is a terrifying future that we have looking ahead. But maybe even more drastic than this realization of a climate emergency is the fact that we need to understand that the climate itself is really just a symptom of a deeper underlying problem, which is the vast ecological destruction that our, our civilization is creating across the board in so many dimensions. It's hard to even keep tabs on it, but just some examples are things like there's been a 68% decline in animal populations just since 1970 alone. And that decline is continuing at faster and faster rates. There's the fact that we're now entering the 6th great extinction of species since life began on Earth. This one, of course, is the only one caused by one actual species, the human species. Even if things could suddenly start improving, we're looking at the virtual annihilation of coral reefs worldwide by probably the middle of this century. And the UN reports that 95% of the Earth's land is going to be degraded by 2050. And all of this is taking place at the current rates of economic production and consumption. And yet mainstream economists are projecting a tripling of that GDP between now and the middle of the century, which is why when scientists are looking at this situation, they're warning that we're rapidly heading for a precipice. A group of scientists led by Johan Rockström a few years back developed a framework called a safe operating space for humanity. And they've shown that out of the 9 different dimensions that they've identified, we've blasted through at least 5 or 6 of those different dimensions already. We've blasted through that safe operating space. So scientists are saying things like, soon it'll be too late to shift course away from our failing trajectory, or there's a very big risk that we will end our civilization. And the UN Secretary General, the ex-General Ban Ki-moon, said it's a global suicide pact. And Antonio Gutierrez, the current Secretary General, has been repeating similar statements. So when we look at this, it's very reasonable to ask, how did we get to this crazy place that we're in right now? And that's something that I looked at in an earlier book that I wrote some years back called The Patterning Instinct, A Cultural History of Humanity's Search for Meaning. And it's something that we explore in the first couple of weeks of the course. And a big takeaway from that understanding is the simple recognition that culture shapes values. Those values shape history. And by the same token, it's our values that whatever values become dominant today that will shape the future. And so what's then important is to try to get a greater sense of what are our values in our current dominant culture. And again, the course looks quite deeply at that. And fundamentally, our values are based on separation. And there's a kind of a story that arises from that fundamental separation we get. A story that tells us that nature is a machine, that humans are separate from nature, that humans are separate from each other, that human progress arises from the conquest of nature, that the earth is a resource to exploit for human benefit. And really, as a result of all that, that the purpose of life is really just to get wealthy and powerful. But the bulk of the course looks at what I write in detail about in this most recent book, The Web of Meaning, which is that every one of those statements that we just looked at that arise out of our dominant worldview are, in fact, they're not just dangerous, driving us to destruction, but they are false, which leads us really to this kind of next stage of the spiral of the work that reconnects, seeing with new eyes. But of course, as we know from the work that reconnects, and we look into detail in the course too, it's not just new eyes, but it's new and ancient eyes. And what a lot of the work that's doing and that we look at in the course is integrating what modern science is telling us with traditional wisdom. So we look at these fundamental questions about life from lenses like neuroscience and complexity science and evolutionary biology and systems sciences, and we look at how they point us to the same deep wisdom that traditional wisdom has been talking about for millennia, whether it's indigenous knowledge or Taoism or Buddhism, which is basically our intrinsic interconnectedness. And so now I'm going to take us through just briefly a taste of each of those questions that Sylvia just raised at the beginning in her introduction. These fundamental questions that basically every human being asks at some point in their life in one way or another, like, who am I? Where am I? What am I? How should I live? And why am I? And let's begin with that first one. Who am I? And if you ask, basically, if you sort of anyone who might be walking down the street in any kind of city in the world today, and you ask them that question, and they would give you an answer based on their sort of general understanding, the answer they would give would probably be based to some degree or other on really what is this most famous statement really in Western philosophy that was coined by René Descartes hundreds of years ago. Yeah, everyone's heard it, of course. Cogito ergo sum in Latin, I think, therefore I am. And this has been viewed, this is really the foundation point of the modern way of understanding philosophy in many ways. But what is so key about, if you think what that statement actually says, I think, therefore I am, it basically implies that human identity itself exists solely through our conceptualizing faculty, that thinking part of our brain, which then kind of implies that animals who don't think like humans, and even our bodies, separate from that thinking part of our brain, really don't have a full existence. They're like really mere machines. But we now know from from ethologists who study animal behavior that animals are most definitely not machines. We know that elephants can communicate with each other over hundreds of miles through infrasound. They perform ceremonies over dead family members. Dolphins and whales, they are now understood to talk to each other in local dialects. They call each other by name, and they're even thought to gossip about those temporarily absent. We know that wolves, for example, show deep family commitment, and males help raise their young until they reach maturity. But now, what we now understand from scientific investigation is that even plants that have traditionally been thought of as not smart like animals have this incredible networked intelligence. It's like a distributed intelligence that plants have, where they have up to 20 different ways in which they sense the environment. Plants are known now to act intentionally and purposefully. They learn and have memories. They communicate with each other through what biologist Suzanne Simard calls the wood wide web. And they can even allocate resources as a community through this wood wide web. And perhaps most amazing of all is biologists who study single cells, microscopic cells we can't even see, discover that every one of those cells displays stunning intelligence. There's an awe-inspiring intelligence in every one of the cells in our own bodies. We have like 40 trillion of these cells that make us, each of us, up as human beings. And every one of these cells has thousands of sensors and proteins. They send and receive hundreds of different signals at the same time. A cell is aware of itself and others. It knows what to do with all that stuff within it, makes decisions. Cells cooperate with each other as community, and they'll even make decisions not by themselves, but as groups. Now, this amazing intelligence of nature is something that Western science is just beginning to get a grasp of. But thousands of years ago in ancient China, there was a sense of this amazing intelligence that nature had that we can see in the thinking of the Taoists. And many of you probably familiar with this great, wonderful classic of Taoism called the Tao Te Ching, which stands for, it translates as the classic of Tao and De. Now, Tao, probably many of you will be aware, it translates to something like the way or the path. And it's like this way in which the forces of nature manifest in the world. But this word De is less known to people. And it refers to like the spontaneity in nature, the intrinsic nature that is inherent in all living things. And when the Taoists looked at the world around them, they called that state of acting with De, with the intrinsic nature that nature had, they called it Wu Wei, or effortless action. And they saw all non-human organisms acting naturally in Wu Wei, whether birds, animals, or even plants. And the Taoists asked, well, what happened to human beings? Because on the one hand, there's this Wu Wei effortless action, but then human beings have this way of acting purposively. And they would talk about it as things like using fire to dry up a well or forcing water uphill to irrigate a mountainside. And of course, these are the things that drive what civilization is all about. And the Taoists were aware of that. And so when they looked at this kind of distinction of being, of experience, they had sort of developed a theory of civilization, which was that in earliest times, in their words, there was this placid tranquility which belonged to the whole world, a state of perfect unity when people lived in common with the birds and beasts, were on terms of equality, like forming one family. But then, in the words of Zhuangzi, one of the great Taoist philosophers, people started everywhere to become suspicious, and men began to be separated from one another. And what is interesting is that modern cognitive anthropology and neuroscience recognizes that that is, in fact, corroborated, that early Taoist theory of civilization is corroborated in what we now understand as human evolution, that we humans have a more developed prefrontal cortex than other animals, which kind of mediates that Yu Wei, that purposive cognition. Modern science talks about it in terms of things like symbolic thought, conceptualizing, planning, and creating abstractions. And cognitive anthropologists now look in history and they see that more advanced human prefrontal cortex is the cause of things like language, culture, art, and tool-making. That was a precursor, obviously, of civilization. So we now recognize that we have a dual human consciousness. We have that conceptual consciousness that Descartes talked about, this analytic, slow, rational, and effortful, which the Taoists saw as Yu Wei. But we also have an animate consciousness that we share with all other creatures, that's intuitive, fast, emotional, effortless, which is more like Wu Wei. So rather than that Descartes idea of I think, therefore I am, we can recognize now that our human challenge is really to integrate both of those systems in harmony with each other. So now when we look at that question, who am I? We can begin to answer it in this different way, like actually I am a mind-body organism capable of integration. And each of these things we look at in the course in a week or sometimes a couple of weeks of going much deeper into these things that I'm looking at right now. And so we move on to this next question of where am I? And the mainstream view of where am I is generally some kind of sense of a split universe, that there's some dimension that might hold like a transcendent God or whatever it might be, and another dimension that has more like the material world. And in modern times, that is divided into this notion of religion and science as being separate from each other. And there's this sense that that separation has led to a large degree to our unsustainable worldview, where it's considered okay to pray to that source of transcendent meaning by many people in the dominant worldview, even while we ransack nature below. But that's not how other cultures made sense of the universe. And if we look once again in traditional China, we see that there developed about 1,000 years ago a school of thinking called the School of the Tao in Song Dynasty China, around 1000 CE. And in this school, they basically integrated three different great traditions in Chinese thought: Taoism and Confucianism and Buddhism. And they created a way of thinking that we know nowadays by the name Neo-Confucianism, even though they call themselves the School of the Tao. And for these Neo-Confucians, when they looked at the universe, they didn't see it separated into two different dimensions, but they saw the entire universe consisting of like what they called qi, which we might think of as matter and or energy, and also li, the principles by which that chi is connected. And so those principles they saw as being fundamentally important to understand, those principles of connection of all the stuff of the universe. And when they looked at this Li, these principles of connection, they looked at the totality of all those Li in the universe, basically as the Tao. And again, if we fast forward to modern times, what we find is that systems sciences also point to a connected universe, whether it's sciences like complexity science, systems biology, or chaos theory. And they show us that everything is connected, but crucially in non-linear ways. So in the famous question that Edward Lorenz, the person who developed chaos theory, asked, said, is it possible that the flap of a butterfly's wings could lead to a tornado in Texas because of these complex nonlinear ways that things are connected? And what systems scientists show us, crucially, as the interactions between things often tell us more about them than the things themselves, whether it's the patterns of starlings flocking in the sky, or schools of fish in the ocean, or the ripples of sand dunes, or the whole weather system on Earth, or even the structure of galaxies. It's oftentimes the interactions that are most crucial. Now, this is sometimes difficult even to get your head around. But one way to do it is to think about yourself, to think of a picture of yourself when you were a little child. This is a picture of me when I was just a little kid. And when I look at that little kid, I know that's me. I may even have the memories to prove it. But the fascinating thing is there's not a single molecule that makes up that little child's body that is in me now. Even the few cells that remain in us all through our lives are constantly changing their components, which is why I know that. So the thing that connects me with that little child is not the stuff, but is actually the Li, those principles of connections that form, that even while the stuff is changing, there's something stable and resilient to the way those interactions happen. And one particular pattern that scientists find to be universal in nature is what they call fractals, which are patterns that repeat themselves at different scales. And they indicate self-organized activity, and they're everywhere in the natural world. We see them in coastlines, in leaves, and lightning, in lungs, in the neurons of our brains. And scientists have begun to realize that the Earth itself, really nature is a fractally connected system, where each cell is a fractal part of an organism, which is fractally part of the species, which is then part of the ecosystem, which then ultimately is part of the living Earth. So now when we look at this question, where am I? We begin to see ourselves in this way as existing as part of a fractally connected, self-organized universe. So let's move on to this next question. What am I? Well, one way to get at this is to look at what one of these great Neo-Confucian sages said, Chu Shi, who said, if one wishes to know the reality of Tao, one must seek it in one's own nature. But then if we look at our own nature and once again ask somebody from mainstream thinking, what is our nature? It's likely the answer it'll be similar, something similar to what Richard Dawkins famously said decades ago in his book, The Selfish Genes, where he said that we and all other animals are machines created by our genes in a highly competitive world. And so we can expect a successful gene to be ruthlessly selfish. And so from that, the dominant way of thinking about what we are is driven by these genes, which are the fundamental unit of evolution. They dictate everything about the organism, and they're inherently selfish and competitive. But once again, what modern science has shown is that every one of those statements about the gene is actually false. And in fact, we live in a world where the evolution of the complexity of life over billions of years since life began on Earth have been driven not by increases in selfishness, but increases in cooperation. In fact, we now recognize that life evolved through cooperation. In the words of systems biologist Lynn Margulis, life did not take over the world by combat, but by networking. And the crucial secret that life developed in that cooperation was this notion of mutually reciprocal symbiosis, where each species learned to work with another species for the benefit of all. And it's that kind of symbiosis that leads to this richness of any ecosystem, where plants photosynthesize and provide nourishment to other animals. The insects pollinate the plants. Animals transport their seeds and fertilize the soil. The fungus regenerates the soil, and it allows those mycorrhizal networks to transport nutrients for the plants. So now we can recognize that organisms themselves are really, in the words of Carl Woese, a biologist, resilient patterns in a turbulent flow. And we need to understand living systems as stable, complex, dynamic organization, which is what has formed this cascade of abundance in life. So now when we look at this question, what am I? We can look at it in terms of, well, I'm a resilient pattern of self-organized cooperation, which really leads to this next question of how should I live? And we're told in the dominant worldview that because humans are intrinsically selfish and greedy, selfish behavior is in the best interest of everyone. That, you know, as Gordon Gekko said in that movie Wall Street, greed is good. And, you know, to his credit, Richard Dawkins doesn't necessarily support that ethical approach, but his approach leads to this statement. He says, because we are born selfish, we have to teach generosity and altruism, so we can try to upset the designs of our selfish genes. But actually, the reality we've now learned from evolutionary biologists is that humans evolved to be cooperative, that early hominids were vulnerable to predators, those who learned to collaborate were the most successful. And human identity expanded from self and kin to include the entire group. So our human ability to cooperate with each other, even those who are not kin, is actually what differentiates us from other primates. And as a result of that, humans developed what are called moral emotions like compassion, guilt, shame, gratitude, or embarrassment. All those things mean that we don't just act morally because we think we should, but we do so because it feels right. And indigenous cultures have always been aware of that. In Africa, there's this concept of Ubuntu, which translates to I am because you are. And in North America, the Lakota tribe talk about Mitakuye Oyasin, which means we are all related. And as a result of that, they have values that are rising from that, values like relationship, responsibility, reciprocity, and redistribution. And that understanding leads to a very different life-based value system. One that was really best described by Albert Schweitzer in the 20th century, when he said, I am life that wills to live in the midst of life that wills to live. And as a result, in his words, I cannot but have reverence for all that is called life. That is the beginning and foundation of morality. So then when we look at how should I live, and this is something we explore over a couple of weeks in the course in some depth, I should live in reverence and care for all life. That leads us to this final one of these existential questions of why am I? And our dominant culture, based on reductionism, basically says, in the words of Steven Weinberg, a famous Nobel laureate reductionist, the more the universe seems comprehensible, the more it also seems pointless. But once we think of meaning itself as being a function of that connectedness that we recognize like the Li of the universe, we can see that as the number of connections increases, it leads to a phase transition and the emergence of new meaning. So when words connect, for example, language emerges. When organisms connect, an ecosystem emerges. When neurons connect, consciousness emerges. And I'm sure many of you will have had some sort of peak experience in your life where you just got that deep sense of the oneness of all things, that deep interconnectivity of everything. And we can now recognize that that is not something that's separate from what science tells us, but is validated by what science tells us. And that connectedness has implications, that everything you do in your life creates those Li ripples, which affect everything else in the universe. This principle of the ultimate connectivity of everything in the cosmos. So we see that we exist in an ocean of Li, and the choices we make, personal choices, or participating in community, or engaging in the broader political progress, are all things that weave the web of meaning. So in answering that question, why am I? We can say, begin to say, I'm here to weave my part in the web of meaning, which leads us finally to that final phase of the spiral of the work that reconnects, this going forth. And the last few weeks of this course that we're looking at looks at this possibility of what we can do to create in our human future, this possibility of an ecological civilization, to actually transform the basis of our global civilization from one that's wealth-based to one that is life-based, to create a global cultural economic system promoting sustainable flourishing for humans and Earth. And we'll look in those final weeks about how this possibility is to build a civilization based on the principles of ecology, how living systems self-organize, because we recognize that ecosystems can remain resilient for millions of years. And what would it look like if we could build a human society on that basis, with an objective, an overriding objective, to create the conditions for all humans to flourish as part of a thriving, living Earth. And we look in this course at how this vision is not a vision of just one particular person or one small group of people, but it's an emerging vision from diverse sources, indigenous sources, community-based sources, spiritual sources, and political sources. And every one of those groups in those all around the world ultimately is saying the same story, this recognition that we are all interconnected in the web of life. And in those last few weeks, we'll look at some of the principles of an ecological civilization, which I won't go into detail now, but principles like symbiosis, holarchy, subsidiarity, regeneration, balance, diversity. And then we end up looking at what that actually would mean in practice, specifically to really feel into what's possible in a different world, like a world based on worker-owned cooperatives and a UN Rights of Nature declaration and agroecology and triple bottom lines required for corporations and a circular economy. And we'll end up with a sense that there's this possibility for us as human beings to not just get stuck in our silos, but to use what's available to us now in the world today to become more of a self-organized collective intelligence. And this realization that as we begin to see ourselves and the living Earth as an integrated whole, we can become a civilization learning how to regenerate and tend our beautiful, fragile Mother Earth that we started out looking at that before. So that just gives you this taster of what this whole 10-week course goes into in some detail. And so now what I'm going to do is stop my screen sharing. And looks like that worked successfully. I'm back to seeing my face again here with you all. And as I said before, I took you through that kind of fairly much a kind of super speed just to give you this taster. If anyone's got got a question or two you'd like to share right now in our public group forum, let's do that. And then after that, we'll move into a breakout group where we can discuss some of these things in more detail. But let me just pause right now and see what anybody would like to share or ask about.
Thank you, Jeremy. And I would like to remind everybody to use the raise hands feature because we have too many people for me to see all of you. So if you can raise your hand and you can see that under reactions, usually under the screen, and raise your hand that way, because if you do it like this, I won't see you. Okay, and I will call people to speak. But first, before we start speaking and sharing questions, I would like to invite all of you who join a little bit later when Jeremy was in the middle of the presentation, just to give you a little bit of a background of what we are doing today. So we went through an amazing presentation. Thank you, Jeremy, about that. And we explore different questions that go actually around the spiral of the work, the Reconnects. And we, after this amazing presentation that was recorded, and you will have access to that, we will be sending a follow-up email with all the resources. You will have the opportunity to ask questions right now, and then we will go into breakout rooms. Those of you who do not want to join breakout rooms, please rename yourself by adding a number 1 before your name. And you will see that some people have an A. The A means that they are guys in the breakout rooms. So having said that, we're going to go from now with a few questions. And I see June. June, go ahead, please.
Hello. The biggest thing I want to say is just how grateful I am and how moved I am and how inspired I am. I'm just so grateful for all the work that you've done and the team that helped you put this together. I'm piloting a course that follows the spiral of the work that Reconnects right now. It's called Step-by-Step Climate Response. And I'm in my 2nd pilot group, but some of the missing pieces, and I'm really struggling to how to sequence things and how to frame things. And what you just gave me is like the greatest, most timely gift. And I can't wait to take the course, and it's going to influence hundreds of people through the work that I do. I'm so grateful.
Oh, June, thank you so much for sharing and sharing your feeling with me. I really get that. And yeah, and really, this is this course itself is not like this cognitive, it is a cognitive exploration, but it's also a heartfelt exploration. And I think many people who took the course will tell you, this is the feeling we get when we talk when I join the group every Friday, and we just talk for an hour. There have been times when I myself have actually kind of broken down with emotion, because we're dealing with deep issues of deep pain and issues of deep possibility and inspiration. And it's really powerful. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that.
It's so beautiful. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you, June.
Thank you.
We have Pamela.
Hi, Jeremy, and all that have joined. I also am very grateful. I am loving the way you're distilling and shaping, and I also feel how this gives us more hope and potential. And I'm working on a proposal right now around reciprocity. It's called the Reciprocity Project, and wanting to use volunteer contexts to create more connectivity to nature, and it has just so much potential that it's not enough to think about this, that to get this new ethical, to support this shifting is about taking action. My question to you is, you mentioned symbiosis. What were the other 2 or 3 biological processes?
Yeah, yeah. That's kind of a crucial theme in the course, because we go into what are the deep principles of life itself, scientifically based, and then look at what that might mean to a society, which does correlate so closely with what indigenous cultures tell us. Like reciprocity is a key foundational value in almost every indigenous culture. But so that mutually beneficial symbiosis is probably the most fundamental thing we learn. But then another key learning is this notion of holarchy, of what I call fractal flourishing. Basically, what the word holarchy refers to is this recognition we looked at in this presentation about fractal patterns being from the cell, from the organism, all the way to a species, to a population, to ecosystems, all the way to Gaia. And when you look at life itself, the term that people use is holarchy, which means it refers to the fact that every system has full systems within it and is also part of a bigger system. So every system, like sort of Chinese dolls, every system exists within bigger systems and has smaller systems within it. And that leads to a primary principle of life itself in ecosystems, of what an ecological system, an ecological civilization could look like, which I call fractal flourishing, which is this realization that one part of the system can only flourish if all the parts are flourishing. You can't have like humans flourish on a earth that is getting destroyed. You can't have one small group of people in a society flourish when other people in that society are struggling and starving and desperate. That you need this fractal flourishing. It's not a zero-sum game, it's a positive sum game. So that's a key one. A third one I'll just touch on, and then, obviously we'll go deeper in the course on these things. But a third one is this notion of what's called integration. And integration specifically means unity within a system along with differentiation. So oftentimes people say, oh, we're all one or whatever. Well, yes, we are all one. And at the same time, we can celebrate the fact that we're all different. And so we, in an ecosystem, the elephants and the trees and the dung beetles and the grass, all utterly different, and yet they're part of something what becomes a unified, coherent whole. Similarly, in a society, we can celebrate racial, ethnic, cultural diversity within different groups, and also then allow each different group to contribute what they offer to make the richest possible society as a whole.
And in that, the diversity actually is part of the nourishing. That if we're not diverse, we all have different gifts.
Precisely.
When you said holarchy, is it spelled W-H-O-L?
No, it's spelled without the W. H-O-L-A-R-C-H-Y.
Oh, wow.
And it comes from the word holon, that as a Greek word. It was actually Arthur Koestler, 20th century thinker, who first came up with that term holarchy, from the Greek notion of a whole basically being part of a bigger whole.
Oh,
thank you, Pamela.
so much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So we have Koila now. Koila, go ahead.
Hi, Jeremy, and hello, everyone. My name is Kolya, and I do lead Work That Reconnects workshops. I also am an environmental educator with faith communities.
Oh.
And I developed a curriculum based on my own faith, which is radical Christian. But what I did was I shifted the deep time part of the spiral to the gratitude section of the beginning. And what's really interesting, I set up a spiral, people walk the 14.5 billion year history. And the conclusion that people reach is such a sense of awe of all this that has come before us. And a few people feel tremendously humbled. Like we're just a spark at the very end of this long, multi-billion history. And you may be familiar with the work of Thomas Berry and others that have talked about, if we would grasp this story, then it's not an exclusive pathway to this consciousness, but certainly essential. And I just want to congratulate you. You've touched on so many threads that I have been exploring over the decades of my life, and you're weaving them together. So thank you.
Yes.
The role of evolutionary consciousness, and I'm a big fan of Lynn Margulis and her and tremendous insights about cooperation within the story of evolution. Thank you for sharing that. And Thomas Berry's work is so incredibly powerful and important. And some people are probably familiar with this there's a great film called The Journey of the Universe, following on this theme of deep time that Brian Swim and Mary Evelyn Tucker have created together. And I definitely recommend searching that out and watching that film. It really gives this profound sense of exactly what you're describing, Kolya. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, everybody. Jeremy, do you think that is a good time to go into the virtual rooms?
I do.
Okay, so I will introduce again the concept because some people are asking in the chat.
Yeah.
So the breakout rooms are going to be for 15 minutes. We have now groups of 3 or 4 people, and some of the groups have a guide. That's a person with an A before the name. The guide is basically a person who has taken Jeremy's course before and can help, moderate the questions. But that doesn't mean anything else, so don't worry. If you don't want or you can't participate because, the place where you are right now into the breakout rooms, you can add a 1 to your name and I will put you in a breakout room, but that will be a breakout room just to relax and you just can turn off your video and your sound until we join again to the conversation. We will end with some questions and answers at the end after the breakout rooms.
Yeah. And
so, Jeremy?
Let me just add, what I might do is I might, for people who are in breakout rooms without one of the alumni, I might just appear for a couple minutes, sort of hover into a room where it doesn't have an alumnus. So if there's a particular question, I may be able to answer right then, but I'll just kind of come in and out because I won't obviously be able to visit all the different rooms at that time. But so if you see me suddenly appear for a couple minutes, don't be too shocked. And then and just to kind of phrase in the question, I invite you to explore when you're in the breakout rooms with each other is basically just this question of what does this phrase deep transformation, what does deep transformation mean to you? And so it's an open-ended question. Yeah, just kind of explore that in yourself with others in the group as you go into it.
Thank you, Jeremy. So it's just because some people came late, so I'm just trying to figure out the breakout rooms together. And I will put that in the chat, the question. You can reopen the chat once you are in the breakout room. So 15 minutes, is that okay, Jeremy?
That sounds perfect.
Okay, so I will prompt you when we have 5 minutes left. Again, if you put the number after you were put in a breakout room and you end up in another breakout room, just don't worry, I will transfer you afterwards, okay? So I'm going to open the breakout rooms right now. You have the question in the chat. There you go, 15 minutes. And again, those who don't want to go to breakout rooms are going to go to a big breakout room. You can have a party there. I'm going to stop the recording. Okay. So welcome back, everybody. We have a few new people, Jeremy, who didn't have the chance to join at the beginning, but they are going to stay for the discussion. So, well, thank you. And I hope you had very good discussions. Jeremy, it's all yours.
Great. Yeah. Well, thanks so much. And I hope that a lot of you in the groups are able to share your own sense of deep transformation, and also find out if there were alumni in your group and questions about the course. But perhaps before we move to any questions right now, because for the next 30 to 40 minutes, I'd like the session mostly to focus on basically the questions people have around the course itself, or more general, bigger questions that have arisen from this discussion today, either questions or reflections that you wanted to add just on these themes, or whatever came up in your breakout groups. But there was once or twice in the groups that I just joined temporarily, there was a kind of question overall about how the course works, what the experience is like week by week. So if an alumnus in your particular group already told you that, then please accept my apologies if it's repeating what you just heard. But just for the sake of everyone to be able to get a sense, I'll just take you through what a typical week would look like on the course, so you can get a feeling. And I think what's crucial about it is that the course is designed to really build a sense of a community within the people who are taking it. So it's not so much just a course where you're kind of learning something and doing homework or whatever, and just kind of in your own sort of world doing it. But it's really about sharing these ideas generatively, co-generatively with others. And so a typical week begins with 2 pre-recorded video lectures that become available for you to watch, like basically like over the weekend. And there'll be so lecture A and B on a similar theme in that week, but sort of following on one to the other. And each of these video lectures, which are usually between like 30 to 35 minutes, sometimes a little bit shorter, sometimes a little bit longer, they end with 1 or 2 questions that ask you for reflection and for discussion. And so when you have these questions for reflection, there's this great online platform where it's very easy to just write your answers, your own thoughts about that question on the platform that others can see and that I can also see. And that generates a lot of really fascinating discussion right there. Then in the middle of the week, there's an opportunities in 2 different time zones. So it works pretty much anyone, no matter what time zone you're in, to join a Zoom call for breakout groups where you can be in smaller groups where you can actually talk live with other people in the course to reflect deeper on those questions that got raised at the beginning of the week. Then meanwhile, if people have questions specifically for me that are arising from this, we have a Google Doc that's sort of live each week where you can actually write the questions into the Google Doc. And if there are questions where there's a relatively simple answer, I can just respond right there in the doc. But then on Friday, each week, we have a live session where I join whoever else on the course wants to join. And we basically, whatever major themes bubbled up through the week, although I've read through what everyone's saying, and I've kind of absorbed what I see as being sort of current in terms of what people are thinking. And then I will talk a little bit to try to answer the bigger topics that arose. And then in that hour, we have the chance for an interactive session, somewhat like today, where, people can ask me whatever they want around the topics for that week. And oftentimes I won't necessarily answer it. These are not sort of processes where I give an answer as if it's like, here's the definitive answer. But oftentimes I'll give the answer as really a leading into an overall thought for deeper exploration for all of us to have. So this hour-long session that I give on Friday is not so much a Q&A as is more a general discussion that I'm sort of centrally sort of participating in on the themes arising from that week. And then we move into the next week. And what's amazing is over this 10-week period is the amount of heartfelt community that actually builds up is quite just a really powerful feeling from that. And I should just add as one final thing is that that community that's built doesn't then get lost. We actually have an online alumnus group that is part of a larger deep transformation network that's an online platform. But it's a group where people can then stay in community and build on those 10 weeks ongoing, basically, indefinitely. So hopefully that was helpful. And let's open this up now if anybody has any questions that or any other reflections you'd like to share right now as a group.
Yes, and please use the raise hand feature from Zoom so you can see who has questions. And the questions don't have to, I mean, they may be around the course, but also maybe about many of the topics that Jeremy summarized at the beginning, or something that came in your group when you were in the breakout room or when you were reflecting. So if you have questions, please use the function of raising your hand. Thank you. Okay, and I see Alicia.
Hi, thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you loud and clear, Alicia.
Oh, good. Yeah, I'm just struck with so much gratitude in the sense of what the question of deep transformation means for me, and feeling the totality of the work that reconnects. And it's just really striking me right now, this deeper sense of what listening internally, what that feels and generates for each and every person. And so I'm having this sense of a lot of faith in the inner work that I'm on the Buddhist path and have been in retreat for years now, and I'm just having this sense of needing to come out and do work with the work that reconnects, and how when we do focus on our inner world, there's this knowing in me that when I let go of this deep fear of the world crashing into, the demise that we've just discussed, it's like this beautiful sense of trust comes from just me being in tune with my path. And like, how could I believe that we're not capable of this incredible process? And so, yeah, I'm just I'm curious in the sense of Joanna Macy's work and what you're working with. What is it that is this faith in this process when we let go of needing to understand? And is that like a denial if I feel so much faith in our process, in the sense of kind of like naivety, or is it actual like letting go into this powerful journey that because we do our own work, then it means that's all we can really do is our own work. Okay.
Yeah, well, thank you, Alicia. Just really beautifully expressed. I was really feeling into what you were saying as you were taking us through that. And yeah, you really raised some of the deepest questions that we do explore in the course, in fact, all through, and that I'm always exploring for myself, because these are questions for which there's no easy answer. And what I hear in your question, the sense of letting go, is a place that I've come to myself, going through these issues really from a place of just feeling them so deeply. This sense of so easy to get pulled into a sense of despair when we see what is happening in the world and the acceleration of the devastation taking place. And I feel that's every day. There's this part of me that absolutely senses that. And so there is this need to kind of let go of things in that respect, and to kind of, I sort of see it as kind of diving into the mystery, in the sense of it does take some sort of sense of faith, but it doesn't mean necessarily faith in some higher power or something like that. But it's really a faith, essentially, in life, in this recognition. It really, for me, it comes from this recognition that that quote from Albert Schweitzer that I gave in the talk, that I am life that wills to live in the midst of life that wills to live. And there's a sense that what is life calling from each of us in this moment where life itself is crying out in pain from what this civilization that is basically life destroying is doing to it. And a large part of that is letting go of attachment to particular outcomes. I mean, we want to see particular outcomes, of course, and we do things for specific outcomes. But then when we get involved in activism, it's very easy to try so hard to something, and then it works, but then it doesn't happen. And then and then it's so easy to feel so just discouraged by the whole thing. And that's where it's so important to actually feel yourself part of giving yourself to it, and know that it's right to do regardless of the outcome. So then hope becomes something different from a sense of setting an expectation for some future based on some probability event or whatever. Hope becomes really what arises from being part of life and giving ourselves to that. And so I do feel this is a way in which our inner work, the deepest inner work, ends up energizing us and ends up allowing us to really offer what we have for the sake of life. But crucially, that only seems to be effective and doable within ourselves when it's with community. None of us has the ability in our own in our own way to find all that power, all that source of energy, and keep putting it out there in a way without connecting with others around it. So that's the other crucial thing, I think, is to do the inner work with others too. So it becomes really inner and outer work, really. And I think what we see, and part of somebody asked me in one of the breakout groups, what does deep transformation actually mean to me? So I feel since each of you are exploring that, let me kind of share with you my perception of that. Is it really does mean transformation at different layers of our identity. A part of what we explore in the course is our identity itself is fractal, basically. There's this part within me, identity within community, identity with all of life, and it involves really looking, reconsidering these core foundational senses of identity in all those parts and realizing one part doesn't exist without the other. So the inner work becomes the outer work, and the community work becomes the ecological work, and all of these things become part of this integrated whole. So anyway, that's just part of my sense. So thank you so much for sharing that with us, Alicia. And let's turn to June.
I have 3 questions. One is if you address race and racism in the course.
Mm-hmm.
The second one is when I'm wanting to know if the Zoom groups, you said we could join breakout Zoom groups, is that, do we kind of jump into one at different time, or do we coalesce with the group and stay with it the whole course? And then my third question is, can we share some of the slides that you use in the course with other people? You might not have an answer for that right now, but
yeah, well, actually I can answer the third one first, just it's simple. The answer is absolutely yes. I share the slides that from the presentations I gave each week, and the only thing I ask is that you basically, if you want to sort of do something more public with them, you just sort of let me know how it's being used or whatever, just so I'm kind of aware of how that's being taken place. But yeah, I encourage this work to be shared as widely as possible. And to just get to your first question, yeah, the question of race is a huge part of this dominant worldview of extraction and exploitation. And it's something that we definitely look at and explore in the course. That what we really get to see is that racism itself is part of this same way of thinking that arose basically first in Europe in the roughly in the 17th century or so. This whole notion of white supremacy came around from this sense of separation and the sense of conquest of not just nature, but of other nations in the world too. And white supremacy and human supremacy are all basically other different dimensions of this worldview that like looks at basically from that earliest time, like white male Christians as being the sort of pinnacle of evolution, if you will, and everything else and every other person being subject to being exploited from that. So yeah, touched on in that regard. And regarding the Zoom groups, Sylvia, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think each week you just get to choose which group you want to be part of. Is that
yeah, yes, we actually offer well, I say we because I am also part of that course. You know, I'm lucky enough to be part of the course of Jeremy at Gaia Education. We offer 2 sets of discussions, one equivalent to 9 a.m. Pacific time and the other one at 7 p.m. Pacific time, to give the option for people from all over the world to join the discussions. So the morning one for us will be more appropriate probably for people in Europe and the East Coast, and Africa and Middle East. And the second one may be more appropriate for people in Asia and people in the West Coast. But you can choose, obviously. Yes, thank you. And we have more questions. I would like to, let's start with Steve Levin.
Thank you, Sylvia, and thank you, Jeremy, for this taster. Very intriguing. Actually, not what you said, but my experience with my partner was immersive, which is what we all want, right? It's not what is said, it's the quality of experience. So that leads me to wonder a couple things. One, do you have a maximum number for the course, or how do you create intimacy? How do you manage the boundaries? Secondly, what modalities do you use so that we're not sharing with each other our opinions and ideas, but rather generating experiences together besides talking? What else do you do?
Yeah, like the questions that you're asking, Steve. And we haven't talked about a maximum number in the course. Last time we had something like about 200 people sign up for the course, which is sounds like too large or unwieldy number, but it ends up working in different ways, because a fair number of people sign up for the course, but then end up not joining in the weekly sessions so much. So they can still, we find out later on, people have had a private experience, if you will, of the course, but also got a ton out of it and then shared that later. And so what tended to happen this first time is that maybe a group of, maybe a large minority, like say 70 or 80 people, were people who would get really more engaged week by week. And then within that, maybe a subgroup within that were really engaged to always be at the midweek discussions and the weekly sessions that I'd be part of. And what seemed to happen is, over time, a sense of intimacy developed, even though they sound like large numbers, that didn't seem to prevent a real feeling of intimacy. And what I found was really interesting is the written passages that people shared created as much intimacy in many ways as the face-to-face Zoom conversations. There was so much deeply personal and authentic sharing. There were many times I was actually moved to tears reading a particular sharing somebody was giving just through the week. And I think that really helped to build that sense of a large sense of group intimacy, was people's willingness and courage and generosity to share things from themselves within the community. Of course, each different community like that develops its own sort of unique character. And so what may be true of one may not be true of another community that then develops. But that was what I found really fascinating. In terms of other modalities, we, for the most part, with the Zoom conversations, have been still sort of on the cognitive place. Like we don't have any sort of kind of structured guided practices or things like that, such as a guided meditation or other things like that. I do actually offer some of those in different formats sometimes through a practice I call Leology, which is things like more actually Qigong based and guided meditation based, other things like that. But our group communication has mostly been really through word and through conversation. And don't know, did I cover your questions you were asking, or was there something I wasn't quite touching on that? I think we need to get you off mute, Steve.
Yeah, I think you've addressed with what you see. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Thank you for asking that.
Yeah.
Went for a walk.
Thank you. Shirley, next.
Yes, I was interested in Joanna Macy's the circular spiral of the flower, the dandelions. And the part that I have a question about is the second one where you feel your feelings. I'm a grief counselor, and I know that pain and suffering and the feelings that go along with that cannot be pasted over with positive thinking. That it is so important to dive into those feelings and just let them happen. Because if you cover them over, you're going to end up in trouble some way, one way or another. So I'm wondering how you approach that topic.
Yeah, great question. Yeah. Something that was interesting in the springtime group that did this course earlier this year is that there were a few people who were familiar, as I am to some degree, with the internal family systems, or IFS modality, which is very wonderful, liberating kind of modality that, in simple terms, and so I don't need to explain to you, but to people who aren't aware of it, kind of allows us to recognize the different strong feelings or voices or energies we have within us, really form a coherent unit of themselves. And it's kind of the notion of internal family systems is sort of recognizing that these are our internal family and honoring each of those different parts. So for me, for example, I was talking before about a sense of despair that I can feel into about what's going on in the world right now. And rather than necessarily going, oh, well, I'm more of a public figure, or I'm sort of talking in a bigger group, I shouldn't be showing that sense of despair because I should be just, focusing on the positive or whatever. It's something different. It's like allowing that to have its full voice within me. And not by giving it that full voice within me and honoring it, that doesn't mean that it's the only truth. It doesn't mean that that's all of who I am, but it means that within that perspective, we can really give it its fullness and not have it be ashamed of where it comes from, but we can also be curious about where it came from. And maybe most importantly of all, touch into that larger part that is in each of us, of that sort of unconditional love, that greater self that can look at those different elements with love. So even those parts can feel safe to be like part of that bigger family. And so that kind of modality is one that I try to encourage, and I think the group as a self-organized coherence really did encourage in people through those weeks. So people were able to share things, oftentimes, and they would be sharing things in week by week, maybe particular perspectives or particular feelings about something that other people in the group we all knew might have diametrically opposite views or feelings about. But there was a sense of safety in the container that these could be expressed, knowing that each of the people who are part of the group is part of that deeper intention to be part of this life-affirming move towards what's possible. And so anything that wants to come up within that container was kind of allowed, and I think felt really safe for people. And of course, the alumni would have to share their experience of that. But that's kind of my approach. I don't know if there's any follow-on that is coming to you, Shirley, from what I was describing.
No, that helps me very much. Thank you so much for everything, Jeremy.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you for the question.
Thank you. And I'm aware of the time, so we're gonna take one or two more questions, and then we will speak a little bit about the follow-up, and we're going to close. Lauren, it's your turn now.
Lauren, I think we need to get you off mute.
Hello, just to thank you all so much. This is such an amazing discussion. So inspired, and give our best regards in the work of reconnecting to help build regenerative communities in value-based and relational approach. This is really an inner work which we bring to others to share ecological work and meaningful interactions to create or effect ripples of transformation through cohesive and inclusive practice in the work at the level of communities and strengthening families in ways forward. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for sharing that, Lauren. Great to hear from you. Thank you.
Thank you. And we have Marielle.
Hello. Thank you everyone for your participation today. And thank you, Jeremy, for all your work. I read the book. I haven't taken the course yet.
Great.
And I'm afraid I have a question that's very specific, but since we have a moment, I'd like to air it.
Yeah.
In the book, you dismiss the hard problem of consciousness in which the asking, why do we have an inner phenomenal experience? You dismiss it as a sort of a repackaging of Cartesian dualism. And Francisco Varela considered the problem a problem. Daniel Dennett considers it one. I was just curious a little bit more about why you consider that problem that way.
Oh, yeah, sure. Yeah, well, I'll try to answer it without going too much into the weeds of the detail for people who aren't as familiar with it. But basically, it's not so much the question that I think is kind of somewhat invalid, but the basis. Oftentimes, when people look at consciousness, they they say there's this kind of notion of the hard problem because it's based on some sense of some separation between the mind and the sort of inner subjective experience and the outer, as if there's this kind of jump, which relates a lot to this sort of dualistic worldview of this sense of there's a material world and there's some world that can't be touched by the material. And it's not so much me that rejects this kind of hard problem of consciousness, but it's really more that I follow the lines of thinking that come a lot from probably the best work is by a neuroscientist called Antonio Damasio, who I think is maybe the leading thinker in these questions about consciousness and the evolution of consciousness. And as he kind of explains, and I sort of explained it earlier in the book, what we see is that consciousness really evolves as life's own way of helping organisms to relate to the world around it. And so this incredible complex subjectivity that is so amazing, this just kind of this mind-blowing complexity of our inner experience, we can look at it as this amazing miracle and feel the vastness of it without necessarily having to say that it's somehow it jumps a dimension to some other sort of some other place. It actually can be understood as an evolved biological process that has arisen over basically billions of years. So it's more that kind of way in which I describe it. But it is, like this is a little bit of a more detailed kind of discussion than I think we want to have for the whole group. So let's leave it at there, but feel free to follow up with me directly if you want to explore that in more detail. I'm happy to share my own sources of thinking with you further. Okay, Marielle, thank you.
Thank you so much. I'll follow up. Appreciate it.
Sure.
And thank you, everybody. We have time for one last question, if anybody has any questions. And the questions don't have to be around the course only. It can be also about the presentation itself that Jeremy provided at the beginning. It's a great introduction to the course, but it's also an introduction for anybody who wants to think about those questions and explore a little bit further. So any questions or comments? Okay, I see Dinesh, you want to speak?
Yes, thank you, Sylvia, and thank you, Jeremy. My question is around the pattern that might relate to species. And, here we are, 8 billion of us that life has created, and we have somehow thrived in one way, and probably not in other ways. But is there a larger pattern that you see that can apply to us as species where we are? Are we here, 8 billion of us, to, in some experiment of nature to see what happens? Or are we here to exist for some time and then go away, or,
Yeah.
What is that pattern?
Yeah, great exploration there, Dinesh. And that is something that we do explore to some degree in the course, is this notion of, there's a lot of people, like either scientists, religious perspectives, or technological perspectives, looking at the increased complexity of the evolution of life since it began on Earth. And we look in some depth at these theories of evolution of complexity of life. And some people may be familiar with Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, the Catholic theologian and scientist, that this notion of the omega point, this sense that this continual increase in complexity is going to lead to this point at which the human development of intelligence and technology kind of merges with the rest of life, and we become this kind of one fully unified integrated organism. That's where we're headed for. And there's also, we also look at this very similar sounding but very different way of thinking that you see, for example, in tech-based thinking. People like Raymond Kurzweil talked about the singularity, where going along this notion of increasing complexity, but then seeing the level of AI and that conceptual consciousness almost breaking out from life 2.0, they call it, to life 3.0, like this, which we look at, and I look at from a more critical perspective. And then there's this notion of how modern civilization, it's in one way we see it as this kind of evolution of complexity. In another way, we recognize that it's destroying the very complexity of life itself. And we explore it from a physics perspective of concept of entropy and negative entropy, and how life itself can be seen as a form of negative entropy, and how our dominant civilization right now is almost destroying that, causing essentially re-entropy. So we kind of look at that in some level of that kind of level of detail to explore these different ways of making sense of this whole unfolding. So thank you for asking that, Dinesh. Yeah, great.
Thank you. Thank you. We only have a few minutes left, so the two more questions, pretty short, and then we're going to be closing. So I see Susan and then Simon, and we are going to be closing the webinar. Susan.
Thank you. Jeremy, I'm curious about how to move forward some starting points right now with shared values, given that in the United States, there's a new bill that everyone's claiming is wonderful for the climate, but it's really going to be mainly just wonderful for the economy. But where do you see starting points for shared values?
Yeah, great question. This is one of those themes that we tend to talk about it again and again through the 10 weeks of the course, because it's so fundamental. And how do we move from, maybe the people taking the course have one set of values, but then we see the world out there is driven by very different sets of values. And so a lot of it has to do with, I think, how do we reach people at deeper layers, even when they might be taking standpoints politically that are very different from what we see as this core most important value systems. And a lot of that, of course, has to do with really trying to connect with them at deeper layers, connecting them from the point of view of shared humanity. And there's some of these concepts of, there's actually a rabbi activist called Michael Lerner. He's written a book called Revolutionary Love, which is this notion of holding at the same time the absolute recognizing what we cannot accept in terms of the violence and the destructive ways in which different groups act in our world right now. And at the same time, holding love and compassion for all beings, and not othering these people that we see on the other side, which actually just ends up reinforcing the separation that we're trying to overcome too. So these are complex issues, and ones that I don't think there's an easy answer for, but ones which we do explore again and again through the course, because ultimately the whole notion of that deep transformation only ultimately has its full value when we can take it out into the world and try to help society as a whole to transform to what we know is possible. So yeah, thanks for raising it. So I don't have an easy answer in a soundbite, but that is a core question that we continually look at through the course.
Yes, thank you. And it's something that is so tied with the, going forth of the spiral as well, how we take that. Simone, do you want to still ask the question? I see that you lower your hand. Yes.
Thank you so much. Jeremy, my question is, who is this course for? And what impact do you hope it has?
Yeah, thanks. Great way to close this. Well, really, this course is for anyone who is looking, is relating to something in the world right now and feels there's something that is fundamentally wrong, but maybe isn't quite sure what it is. And it could be somebody who just feels in their own life something is wrong and there's something needs to be transformed, or could be it's looking externally and saying something has to happen at a deep transformation. But it's for anyone who feels there's something that is deeply wrong, wants to explore more about what that is, but also wants to do it with the intention of being part of the movement towards trying to transform it into something better too. So it's not just to sort of double down on how screwed up everything is, but it's about really looking at what is wrong deeply, honestly, openly, and not letting that end up getting us discouraged, but actually letting that us towards a path that can truly lead to something positive. So anyone who's got that kind of intention is really who this course, I think, speaks to. And yeah, thank you for asking that final question, Simone. Like my own intention for the course, really, and for my own life and all that I do, is that for enough of us working together, working through connecting with what we're doing, sharing with others, and looking deeply at what's possible, and really giving ourselves to this process, the possibility that we can actually be part of this global broad movement towards a life-affirming future, and that we can, as a group, thinking together, caring together, recognizing that we are something bigger than each of us separately, just might have this possibility to help amplify this movement towards what's possible. So thank you for asking that.
Thank you so much. I just want to name that you could be offering this course in like a really Ivy League university somewhere, and it could be very elite and hard to access. And I just love, yeah, the spirit of generosity and enthusiasm that you bring to all of us. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Simone. Thank you for that. Yeah.
Thank you. And that was a wonderful question to close, to be honest, because when Jeremy and I sat to organize this webinar, one of the things that I was sharing from the point of view of the World Reconnects network is how a wonderful offer for our facilitators and for the people who practice the World Reconnects, because Jeremy's work is a work of synthesizing and studying so many things that we need to have the words and the understanding. And it's for many, it's an introduction, to all those topics. It's like a buffet that you can, taste here and there, and then decide where you want to put more effort. So thank you, everybody, for showing up. Thank you, Jeremy, for the work that you are doing. And you will have a follow-up email with the recording where you can watch the presentation and the discussions, some extra resources, and there is a special discount. It's a temporary discount in the course. The course is already discounted, so but there is a discount for those of you who have registered for this webinar. So thank you so much, everybody, for coming.
Yeah, thank you. And let me just add really a big thank you to you, Sylvia, for organizing this. Thanks to everyone taking part and showing your interest. And really a special thank you from my heart to all the alumni who took the time generously to show up today to share their experience with everybody else there. And feels so great to be part of this growing community. So thank you to you all.
Yes, thank you.